The alarm didn't wake Decker Hale anymore. He was already up before it had been for 3 years, sitting at the small kitchen
I
table
must
in his
say,
Charleston
the
apartment
ambiance here
with a cup
is
of coffee
unmatched.
that had gone lukewarm while he stared at nothing in particular. The window faced east. He watched the light change. That was the whole of it. That was the morning. He was 62 years old, and he had designed 14 public buildings in 5 cities, 2 of which had won regional architecture awards, one of which had a small bronze plaque near the entrance with his name on it. He had not been back to see that plaque in 4 years. He wasn't sure why. He just hadn't gone. The apartment was clean. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not decorated, not comfortable in any deliberate way, just clean in the manner of a man who had learned that order was something he could control when everything else had stopped cooperating. The books on the shelf were arranged by height, not subject. The dishes were always done. The bed was made with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with needing somewhere to put the discipline that used to go into his work. He drank his coffee standing at the window now because sitting felt too much like waiting, and he was tired of the feeling of waiting without knowing what for. His name was Decker Hale, and he had been a different man once. He knew this the way you know a fact about history accurately, but without any real feeling attached to it. The man he had been before had filled rooms differently, had taken up space in the way of someone who believed the space was his to take. He had been good at his work, genuinely good, the kind of good that other people notice and remark on, and he had let that goodness become the whole architecture of his identity without understanding what a dangerous thing that was to do. When the work collapsed, so did he. Not visibly, not in any way that would have been legible to the people who passed him on King Street or nodded at him in the elevator of his building. He went to the grocery store. He paid his bills. He took his walks. But inside the scaffolding, something load-bearing had given way, and he had been quietly rebuilding around the damage ever since not fixing it, just building around it the way you frame a wall to avoid the crack instead of repairing the crack itself. He thought about Raina most mornings. That was the honest answer to the question no one asked him. He thought about her in the specific way of a man who understands he has done damage that cannot be undone and is not sure if attempting repair would help or only prove how far gone things were. Raina was 34. He had missed 5 years of her life in the way that mattered most. Not physically absent, he could have called, could have driven up any weekend in those 5 years, but absent in the way of someone who has nothing left to offer and knows it, and makes the choice to disappear rather than show up empty. He had told himself it was for her sake. He had believed that for about 8 months before he stopped believing it and kept doing it anyway, which was the part he found hardest to sit with in the mornings. He had a granddaughter he had never met. Her name was Poppy, and she was 5 years old, and he knew this the way he knew most things about his daughter's life now, through his cousin Gerald, who lived in Trenton and kept up with Raina in the loose way of family that stays connected without being close. Gerald had called in October not to pass judgment, just to pass information in the blunt manner of a man who thought information should move between people who needed it. She's working 3 shifts a week, Deck. Night shifts. The girl's running on fumes. Decker had thanked him and hung up and sat with it for 2 weeks. Then he'd gotten in the car. He didn't call ahead. He had rehearsed calling ahead approximately 40 times in the 14-hour drive from Charleston to Philadelphia, turning the conversation over in his mind, trying to find the version of it that didn't sound like an ambush or an apology or a demand dressed up as concern. He couldn't find that version. So he drove instead, which was its own kind of answer about who he was and how he handled things he didn't know how to say. Philadelphia in November was gray in the way that committed to itself. Not threatening, not dramatic, just gray fully and without apology, the kind of sky that had decided on its position and wasn't interested in debate. He drove through it with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, which was how he drove when he was thinking seriously about something, and he had been thinking seriously about this for a long time. He found the hospital without difficulty. He had looked it up before he left. Jefferson University Hospital, Northeast Side, 12-minute drive from the apartment address Gerald had given him. He had that too, though he hadn't gone there first. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because going to her home felt like trespassing in a way the hospital didn't. Or maybe because he needed neutral ground. Or maybe because he didn't have a reason that made sense and had learned to stop requiring his reasons to make sense before he acted on them. He parked in the visitor structure and sat in the car. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. Raina's shift ended at 4. He knew this from Gerald, who had mentioned it in the offhand way of someone relaying a train schedule. He had 45 minutes. He did not use them productively. He sat in the car and looked at his hands on the steering wheel and thought about the last time he had seen his daughter, which had been 5 years ago, at a diner in Wilmington, Delaware, halfway between Charleston and Philadelphia. Her suggestion, neutral geography, and the conversation had lasted 40 minutes and ended with Raina setting money on the table for her half of the check and saying very quietly, not with anger, but with the specific flatness of someone who has decided on something, "I'll call you when I'm ready." She had not called. He had not pushed. And 5 years had become the shape of the space between them. He got out of the car at 3:40. The hospital lobby was the specific kind of busy that hospitals always were: purposeful movement, low-grade tension, the smell of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee from the cart near the entrance. Decker stood to the side of the main flow of foot traffic and looked around without knowing entirely what he was looking for. What he found instead was a small waiting area near the elevator bank on the left side of the lobby. 3 chairs, a low table with a worn magazine, and a paper cup someone had forgotten. 2 of the chairs were occupied. An older woman, 67, maybe 70, sat in the far chair with her hands folded in her lap, in the posture of someone accustomed to waiting without complaint. And in the chair beside her, a small girl in a red coat with dark curls escaping from beneath a yellow knit hat, sat with a crayon in one hand and a piece of paper on her knee, working on something with the focused intensity of someone engaged in serious business. Decker stopped walking. He stood 12 feet away from his granddaughter and did not move, and the feeling that passed through him in that moment was not something he had words for. It was not warm, not exactly. It was more like the feeling of recognizing something you hadn't known you'd lost. A sudden awareness of an absence that had been there so long it had started to seem like the natural shape of things. The girl looked up. She had gray eyes, his mother's eyes, the eyes that came through on that side of the family, and she used them with the same directness he recognized from Raina at that age. A directness that brooked no softening. She looked at him the way adults look at each other only when they think no one is watching. "Are you lost?" she said. Decker blinked. He was not a man who blinked at questions. He had spent 30 years in rooms full of city planners and budget committees and zoning boards, and he had learned to hold himself steady under scrutiny of all kinds. But this 5-year-old in a red coat had asked him a question with such direct simplicity that it bypassed every professional reflex he had and landed somewhere underneath all of that. "I'm not sure," he said, which was, he realized, the most honest answer he had given anyone in a very long time. The girl considered this. The older woman beside her had looked up now too, watching him with calm eyes that took his measure without announcing they were doing so. "I'm waiting for my mom," the girl said, as though this explained everything, which in her world it probably did. "Is your mom a nurse here?" Decker asked. "She's the best nurse," the girl said with the confidence of someone reporting established fact. "Poppy." The older woman's voice was gentle but precise. "We don't talk to strangers." "He doesn't look like a stranger," Poppy said, which was a distinction that appeared to make complete sense to her. "I'm Decker," he said to the older woman, because it seemed like the thing to do. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, recognition, or something adjacent to it, though he had never met her. "Opal Garland," she said. "I watch Poppy when Raina's on shift." He nodded. He didn't say more and she didn't ask more, and they sat in the specific silence of 2 adults who have understood something about a situation that the child between them has not yet been told. He stood there for another few minutes, which felt much longer than they were. Poppy had gone back to her drawing. She was drawing a house, he could see a very specific house, with careful attention paid to the number of windows, which told him something about her without her saying a word. He heard the elevator before he heard Raina. The doors opened and she came out with the particular walk of someone who has been on their feet for 11 hours and has decided that the body's complaints are not relevant information. She was in scrubs the color of dark blue, her hair pulled back, her eyes moving across the lobby with the efficient scan of a person who manages a lot of variables at once. She found Poppy first. She would always find Poppy first, and her face changed slightly, the small involuntary softening that parents can't prevent when they see their children safe. Then she found Decker. She stopped walking. Not a dramatic stop, not the stop of someone in a film, just a half second, a single beat, where her feet paused and her face did something complicated that she resolved very quickly into an expression that gave nothing away. Then she crossed the lobby toward Ms. Garland, and Poppy crouching to receive Poppy's immediate report about the drawing and the house and something that had happened with the crayon near the elevator, and she listened to all of it with her full attention before she looked up. She said to Ms. Garland without looking at Decker, "Can you take her to the car?" Ms. Garland rose without question. She took Poppy's hand, gathered the drawing and the crayons with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, and guided the girl toward the exit. Poppy went, but not before turning to look back at Decker with those gray eyes. "Bye," she said. "Bye," he said. Then they were gone through the sliding doors, and it was just Decker and his daughter standing 10 feet apart in the lobby of Jefferson University Hospital, and Raina looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "You have 5 minutes," she said. Not angry. That was the thing that registered first and stayed. She wasn't angry. He had prepared for anger, had been preparing for it for 14 hours in the car, running through the various forms it might take, the words it might use, the ways he would try to absorb it and respond to it. He had not prepared for this, for the specific, measured, almost clinical quality of her voice. This was not the voice of a woman in the middle of feeling something. This was the voice of a woman who had already been through the feeling and come out the other side of it into something colder and more durable. "Raina, I know why you're here," she said, not loudly, not with heat, just clearly. "And I need you to know whatever you think you owe me, I don't want it." He was quiet. "Gerald talks too much," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact being noted for the record. "He does," Decker agreed. She crossed her arms, not in the way of someone who is cold, but in the way of someone organizing their body for a conversation they want to get through. "I have a system," she said. "It's not pretty, it doesn't have a lot of room in it, but it works and I built it, and I don't need someone walking in and trying to fix it." "I'm not here to fix anything." She looked at him. "Then what are you here for?" He had thought about this question for a very long time. He had answers, several of them prepared in different registers for different versions of how this conversation might go. But standing here looking at his daughter's face, at the particular quality of exhaustion in her eyes, that wasn't just the 11-hour shift, but something longer and deeper than that, all the prepared answers left him. And what he said instead was the thing that was simply true. "I don't know," he said. "I just drove." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite softening, more like the flicker of recognition that passes between two people who are more alike than either would prefer to admit. "I have to get home," she said. "Poppy hasn't eaten since noon." "Of course." He stepped back. I'm going to be in the city for a few days." She didn't react to this information, just held it in the way of someone noting a weather report. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She walked past him toward the exit. At the sliding doors she stopped and looked back, not at him exactly, more at the general space where he was standing. "There's a decent diner on Locust," she said, "if you need somewhere to eat." Then she was gone through the doors, and he was standing alone in the lobby, and the hospital went on being exactly what it was, and he stood there for a moment and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the thing that exists in the same territory as hope just before it becomes that. He found a hotel 6 blocks from the hospital. Budget category, the kind with a small desk and a window that faced the building next door, and a coffee maker that worked if you were patient with it. He had stayed in better places in his career. He had also stayed in worse. He unpacked methodically 3 days of clothes, his toiletry bag, the book he was working through slowly because he could only read about 20 pages at a stretch before his mind drifted. And then he sat on the bed and looked at the wall and thought about Poppy asking him if he was lost. He called Gerald that night, not to report, just to he wasn't sure why. Gerald picked up on the second ring, asked no questions about what had happened, mentioned that it had rained in Trenton, and eventually said before hanging up in the way of someone offering the smallest possible thing, "You did right going up their deck." Decker said he wasn't sure about that. Gerald said that wasn't the point. The next morning, Decker was at the coffee cart in the hospital lobby at 6:45 a.m. before Raina's shift started. He bought 2 cups his own and 1 black with 1 sugar, which was how Raina had taken her coffee since college, a fact he still had, and he left her cup at the nursing station with her name on it, written on a piece of paper he'd torn from his notebook in the elevator. He left before she arrived. He did the same thing the next day, and the day after that. On the second day, the cup was still on the nursing station when he walked past at noon. She hadn't taken it. On the third day when he walked past, it was gone. He kept walking. He didn't allow himself to read too much into it. It was a cup of coffee. He had learned somewhere in the process of losing everything that had made him who he thought he was. That meaning had to be earned slowly and built incrementally, and that the people who tried to rush that process were people who hadn't yet understood what they'd done. On the fourth evening, 3 days into his second week in the city, something shifted. He had been walking back from Franklin Square when he passed Raina's building on Callow Hill. Not deliberately, just the route he'd taken, and as he passed the front entrance, the door opened and Ms. Garland came out with Poppy, both of them in coats, headed somewhere with purpose. Ms. Garland saw him and stopped. Poppy saw him and her eyes went to the paper bag in his hand, which contained a sandwich and a container of soup from the deli on Locust that he'd been eating from all week. "Is that from Locust Deli?" Poppy asked. "It is," he said. She looked at the bag, then at him. "They have good chicken soup," she said. It was a statement of fact offered without particular warmth, but also without suspicion. "They do," he said. "It's what I have." Poppy looked at Ms. Garland. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind that exists between a child and a trusted adult who have developed a shorthand over years. Then Poppy looked back at him. "My mom didn't eat yet," she said. "She came home and went to sleep." He understood what was being said. Not by Poppy explicitly, but by the situation, by Ms. Garland standing beside Poppy with an expression of absolute neutrality that was he had come to understand her version of a suggestion. "I have extra," he said, which was not true, but could be made true with a phone call. 20 minutes later, he left a container of soup and a wrapped sandwich at the front desk of Raina's building with her apartment number and no note. He walked back to the hotel and ordered something else for himself. The next morning, Raina called him. Her voice was different from the hospital lobby, shorter, less guarded, the way people sound when they haven't yet decided how to be with someone and the hour is too early for performance. "That was from the deli on Locust," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Poppy told you I hadn't eaten." "She mentioned it." A pause, not hostile, considering. "There's a public park 2 blocks from the hospital on Chestnut," she said. "If you wanted somewhere to walk, Thursday, 4 o'clock. He didn't say thank you. She wouldn't have wanted that, he understood. "I'll be there," he said. She hung up. He sat on the hotel bed and looked at the window that faced the building next door and thought about a 5-year-old who had noticed her mother hadn't eaten and had done something about it with the materials available. He thought about where she got that from. He was at the park at 3:45. It was a small park, a rectangle of green between 2 blocks of 19th century brownstones with a walking path and some mature oaks that had dropped their leaves by now, leaving the branches in the clear November air like pencil lines against gray paper. There was a playground at the south end, 2 benches, a climbing structure, a slide, and a swing set. The swing set had 2 swings. One was fine. One had a chain on the left side that had detached at the top anchor and been twisted around the support bar. Someone's workaround solution, functional but wrong, the kind of fix that holds things in place without actually resolving the problem. He had the right tools in his jacket pocket. He'd bought them that morning at a hardware store 3 blocks from the hotel, a length of chain the correct gauge, 2 S-hooks, a small wrench. He crossed to the swing set, examined the anchor point, and got to work. It took him 17 minutes. He was not a fast worker, but he was a precise one, and precision was what the job required. He tested the repaired swing twice, sat in it briefly to check the weight tolerance, felt briefly and magnificently absurd. A 62-year-old man in a jacket and slacks sitting in a child's swing in an empty playground, then stood up and brushed off his coat. "You're early." He turned. Raina was standing at the park entrance, still in her scrubs under a dark green coat that had been well used. She was looking at the swing set. "The swing was broken," he said. She walked toward him slowly, her hands in her pockets, looking at his repair work with the particular scrutiny of someone who has learned to check the quality of things that matter. She took hold of the repaired chain and pulled it firmly. Pulled again. Sat in the swing, briefly rocked forward and back. She stood up. Didn't say it was good work. He didn't need her to. There are better parks in this city, she said, which was not about the park. This one's close, he said, which was not about the distance. They walked. Not side by side exactly, she kept half a step ahead, which was her pace, not a statement. He matched it. The oaks were bare but tall, and the light came through them at the low afternoon angle of November, in a way that fell across the path in long, narrow segments. They walked for a while without talking, which was a thing Decker had always been able to do with her even before everything, even when she was small. Raina had never needed words to fill silence. He had always thought that was one of the things she had gotten from him, and now he wasn't sure if that was something to take credit for or just a fact to note. "Ms. Garland said you were asking about Poppy," she said eventually. "I wasn't asking," he said. "I was listening," she offered. Raina looked at the path ahead. "Ms. Garland doesn't offer things to people she hasn't decided about." He let that sit. "Poppy has her checkup in December," Raina said. This was not an invitation. He understood that. It was information being provided in the neutral way of someone who has decided to stop actively withholding things without deciding what that means yet. "What's she like?" he asked. He knew this was a question he shouldn't need to ask, and he asked it anyway because not asking it would have been the worst dishonesty. Raina was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality in it, not soft, but less careful. "She's direct," she said. "She says exactly what she means and expects the same from everyone else. She doesn't have a lot of patience for people who don't mean what they say." She paused. "She fixed the refrigerator shelf herself last month. It had a cracked hinge. She got tape from the kitchen drawer and rigged it." Another pause. It held. He didn't say anything. He was thinking about a 5-year-old looking at a broken thing and deciding to fix it rather than waiting for someone else to. "She gets that from you," Raina said, quietly. Not warm, but honest. He kept his eyes on the path. "I wasn't around enough to give her anything." "No," Raina said, "but some things don't transfer through presence." They walked for another half hour. He did not bring up the money or the reason he was here or any of the things he had come to eventually say. She did not ask him to. When the light started dropping in the way of late November afternoons, quickly without much warning, she said she had to get back for Poppy, and he said of course, and they walked to the park entrance together. She stopped at the gate. "Same time Thursday," she said. It was not a warm question. It was not a cold one. It was the question of a woman who has decided to allow something one measured step at a time without committing to what the steps add up to because she is too careful and too tired to commit to things that haven't proven themselves. "Same time Thursday," he said. She walked away down the block. He watched her go the way fathers watch their children, without children knowing they're being watched, with a specific quality of attention that has nowhere to put itself and no purpose except to see clearly. He walked back to the hotel. He passed the hardware store on the way, and he slowed down in front of it, and he stood there for a moment looking at the display in the window without really seeing it, and he thought about the swing set and the chain and the 17 minutes and the way Raina had pulled the chain without saying it was good. He thought about the last 5 years. He thought about the man he had been at 57 when Whitmore Crane had walked out of their shared office with a briefcase full of documents and Decker's professional credibility in his back pocket, and the full intention of letting Decker absorb the damage. He thought about the months that followed the investigation, the quiet ruination, the phone calls. He hadn't returned because there was nothing worth saying yet. He thought about the moment he had understood that his daughter would find out, and the choice he had made in that moment not to call her, not to explain, not to let her see him in the middle of the collapse. He had told himself it was to protect her. He had been lying, and he had known it while he was doing it, which was the part he found hardest to look at directly. He had been protecting himself from her, seeing him reduced from the specific shame of a man who has built his identity on competence, watching that identity come apart in front of someone whose opinion of him he could not afford to lose. He had made the coward's calculation. He had been hiding in plain sight ever since. The hardware store window reflected his face back at him. 62 years old. Hair gone fully silver in the last 3 years, which happened faster than he expected. The jaw still there, the eyes his daughter hadn't gotten, but his granddaughter had. A man who used to fill rooms differently. He turned away from the window and kept walking. The following Thursday, Raina brought Poppy. He wasn't prepared for that. He had thought he hadn't thought about it specifically, but if he had, he would have assumed they needed more walks first. More of these careful, measured exchanges, more of the slow accumulation of presence before she would allow that. So when he saw them coming through the gate, Raina with her hands in her pockets, Poppy 2 steps ahead in the red coat and yellow hat, moving with the directional confidence of a child who always knows where she is going. He felt something that moved through him too fast to organize. Poppy saw the swing immediately. She changed course without announcement and headed for it at speed, not running but moving with that particular determination that distinguishes a child with a mission. She grabbed the repaired swing, tested it in exactly the same way Raina had pulled the chain, sat down, rocked, and then looked over at Decker. "This one used to be broken," she said. "It did," he said. She rocked again. "Did you fix it?" "I did." She looked at him with those gray eyes. The assessment lasted several seconds. He did not fidget under it. "How did you know how to do that?" she said. "I worked with buildings for a long time," he said. "You learn how things fit together." She considered this. Then she pushed off and began to swing, not high, just enough to feel the motion. And she said almost to herself, like she was logging the information, "Okay." He stood at a respectful distance, hands in his coat pockets, and watched her swing. Raina had come to stand beside him close enough that he could have turned and spoken to her without raising his voice. She was watching Poppy. "She doesn't warm up to people easily," Raina said quietly. "It takes her a while." "She seems direct," he said. "That's not the same thing," Raina said. A pause. "She's watching you. She'll decide when she's decided." After a while, Poppy dragged her feet to slow the swing to a stop and climbed off and walked over to Decker and stopped in front of him. "Do you know how to draw?" she said. "Not particularly," he said. "Can you try?" He looked at Raina. Raina looked at the middle distance in a way that was not quite a smile. He crouched down to Poppy's level. "What do you want me to draw?" Poppy reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a short crayon, a well-used blue, and held them out. "A dog," she said, "but a good one. Not the kind that looks like a potato." He took the paper and the crayon. He drew a dog. It did not look like a potato. It looked more like a dog than he expected, given that he had not drawn anything freehand in 20 years, because the muscle memory of draftsmanship doesn't fully leave you. Poppy examined it with her head tilted. "That's pretty good," she said, which was clearly not something she said often. She took the paper back, looked at it again, and said, "You can try again next time if you want." He stood back up. His knee registered the motion with the mild complaint that it had recently begun to make on stairs and from low positions, and he absorbed this information without comment. "Next time," he said. Poppy folded the paper carefully and put it back in her pocket and walked toward the climbing structure. She did not look back. The transaction was complete. Decker stood next to Raina in the November afternoon and watched his granddaughter negotiate the climbing structure with systematic deliberateness, not timid, not reckless, just careful in the way of someone who thinks before committing weight. "She kept the drawing," he said. "She keeps everything she decides is worth keeping," Raina said. He didn't say anything to that. He just stood there in the particular cold of a Philadelphia November afternoon with the bare oaks overhead and his granddaughter climbing and his daughter standing close enough that he could hear her breathe. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern. Thursdays in the park. Poppy's agenda each time: new questions, new problems, new assessments of things she had been thinking about since the week before. She brought him a library book about suspension bridges on the third Thursday and said the explanation was incomplete, and he agreed with her and explained what was missing, and she listened with the whole of her face in the way that children listen when they have decided something is worth their full attention. "So the bridge doesn't hold up," she said when he finished. "It holds down." He looked at her. "Yes, that's exactly right." She nodded, filed it, moved on to the next thing. One Thursday evening, when Poppy had run ahead toward the climbing structure, Raina came and sat on the bench beside him. Not close, not far, just on the bench. "She talks about you," Raina said. He kept his eyes on Poppy. "What does she say?" "She says you know how things work." A pause. "She said that to Ms. Garland on Tuesday. I wasn't supposed to hear it." He didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about the bridge conversation, about Poppy's formulation, holds down, not up, and the way a child can sometimes arrive at the precise center of a thing without knowing she's done it. She's something, he said. She is, Raina said, and for the first time since he'd come to Philadelphia, the words carried something that wasn't just information. He was at his hotel desk on a Tuesday evening, working through notes from a phone call with his accountant, the finances of his Charleston life being slowly managed from a distance when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Then before he could look at it properly, a second text from the same number. "This is Poppy. I borrowed Ms. Garland's phone. Can you come Saturday? I have a problem with something." He stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, "I can come Saturday. What's the problem?" Her response arrived 30 seconds later. "It's about rabbits, the ears specifically. I'll explain when you get here." He put the phone down. He looked at the wall. He had spent 5 years telling himself that absence was sometimes the responsible thing, that some situations were better left undisturbed, that arriving with nothing to offer was worse than not arriving at all. He had built an entire philosophy around that idea. He had built it carefully, and he had lived inside it, and sitting in a budget hotel room in Philadelphia on a Tuesday night with a text from his granddaughter about rabbit ears on his screen, he understood with sudden and complete clarity how small that philosophy had always been. He was at Raina's building at 10 o'clock Saturday morning with a bag from the deli on locust soup for Raina, who he knew was coming off a night shift, in a chocolate milk for Poppy, which was a guess but felt right, and when he buzzed up, it was Poppy who answered the intercom. "It's me," he said. "I know," she said, and buzzed him in. Raina was in the kitchen in a robe, both hands around a mug, the specific posture of someone who has worked all night and has not yet negotiated with the day. She looked at the bag he was carrying and said nothing, which he was coming to understand was her version of thank you. Poppy pulled him immediately toward the small table in the living area where she had laid out a drawing and a library book about animals open to the section on rabbits. She explained the problem with precision. The ears in her drawing didn't look right, specifically the way the inner ear curved, and the book's illustration was not adequate as a reference because whoever drew it had simplified in a way that lost the essential quality. He sat down across from her and they worked through it together 3 iterations, each one better. Poppy studying each version with the critical attention of someone who had a clear internal image of what she was trying to achieve and would not accept a substitute. On the 3rd attempt, she said, "That's it." "Yes," he said. She sat back and looked at it. "How do you know when something looks right?" He thought about it. "You build up a library," he said, "of things you've looked at carefully. And when something matches what's in the library, you feel it." She considered this seriously. "So I need to look at more things." "Carefully," he said. "Looking isn't enough. You have to really look." She nodded, made the internal adjustment, and moved on. Raina had come to stand in the doorway between the kitchen and the living area at some point during this exchange, mug still in hand. He didn't know when she'd gotten there. She looked at the drawing on the table, then at her daughter, then at him. "Soup's getting cold," she said. They ate at the small kitchen table, Raina Decker and Poppy, with the particular kitchen table quiet of people who don't yet know each other's rhythms, but are beginning to learn the edges of them. Poppy ate with one hand and held the corrected rabbit drawing with the other, studying it periodically, as though it might change between glances. After a while, she looked up at Decker. "Are you coming back next Saturday?" He looked at Raina. Raina was looking at her soup, but she wasn't telling Poppy not to ask, which was its own kind of answer. "If it's okay," he said. Poppy looked at her mother. Raina looked up from her soup, looked at Poppy, looked at him. "Saturday's fine," she said, and went back to her soup. It was, Decker thought, the closest thing to an opening he had been given in 5 years. He was not going to waste it. The Saturday visits became part of the week's structure, not by declaration, by the quiet accumulation of Saturdays in which both of them showed up and neither stopped. Decker arrived at 10, usually with something from the deli that he left on the counter without fanfare. Ms. Garland was often there in the mornings, arriving early out of habit, and because she had, in the way of certain people who give without accounting for it, made Raina's household her responsibility in all but name. Poppy always had an agenda. This was not negotiable and was not presented as such. She simply began wherever they had left off, or wherever her thinking had moved in the week between, and expected him to keep up. He did. He found that he was good at it, which surprised him slightly. given that his experience with children had been primarily theoretical for the last several decades. By the third Saturday, Poppy had started bringing him problems she had been saving specifically for him. Not because she couldn't have asked someone else he understood, but because she had determined that he was the right person for certain categories of question, the ones involving how things worked, how things were built, why things were shaped the way they were. She brought him a broken watch mechanism she'd found in a drawer and wanted to understand. She brought him a sketch of a building she'd seen from the school bus window and wanted to know if the proportions were right. She brought him the rabbit ears question, which had been the first and which he had come to understand was also a kind of test. He passed the test without knowing he was taking them, which was probably the right way to pass them. The Thursday walks continued alongside the Saturdays. Raina on Thursdays, usually without Poppy, unless Poppy inserted herself, which she did with increasing frequency, as December moved into the city and the oak trees in the park stood bare and black against the winter light. Raina walked half a step ahead. He matched it. The silence between them was changing, not filling with words, but changing in quality the way the silence in a room changes when the person in it has decided to stop holding something at arm's length. On a Thursday in early December, Raina stopped on the path and turned to face him. Not with drama, just stopped. "Why didn't you call?" she said. "In those 5 years, even once." He had known this question was coming. He had been waiting for it the way you wait for a structure to be stress tested, knowing the load was coming, knowing it was the right thing for the load to come, wanting to know if what he'd built could bear it. "I've been thinking about how to answer that," he said, "and I keep arriving at the same place." She waited. "I'll tell you the full truth," he said, "but I need you to understand that I'm telling it not because I want anything from it. Not forgiveness, not a particular response, just because you deserve to have the actual reason." She was looking at him steadily. "Okay," she said. He told her about Whitmore Crane. He told it the way he had decided to tell it plainly, without the careful framing he had once constructed for this story, and then abandoned. He and Crane had been partners for 11 years. Hale and Crane Design Associates Commercial and Civic Architecture. A solid firm with a good reputation built on 30 years of Decker's work and Crane's talent for landing clients. What Decker had not seen or had not allowed himself to see was that Crane had been systematically misallocating firm funds for the better part of 3 years, billing clients for materials and labor that didn't exist, running the overages through accounts structured in ways that looked legitimate from the inside and were not. When the model began to collapse, Crane had moved with precision and speed, restructured the principal liability and documentation that put Decker's signature on things he had signed in good faith, and that Crane had subsequently altered, walked out with a briefcase and a plan, and left Decker holding an investigation and a reputation that had been quietly, methodically dismantled. "The investigation cleared me," he said. "Eventually. But eventually was 18 months, and by the time it was over, the firm was gone, the clients were gone, and I was 60 years old with my name on a placard outside a closed office." Raina had gone very still on the path beside him. The park was quiet around them. 2 pigeons moved along the far edge of the path, indifferent and purposeful. "During those 18 months, he said, I made a choice. I didn't call you. I told myself it was because I didn't want you involved, didn't want the legal proximity to affect you. That was partially true." He stopped. "But the larger truth was that I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want your opinion of me, which was already damaged, to become something I couldn't recover from. So I made the coward's choice. I disappeared instead of letting you see me struggle." He paused. "You paid for that. Poppy paid for it. I know that. I'm telling you because you deserve the actual reason, not the version that makes me look less responsible for it." The silence that followed was long. When Raina spoke, her voice was stripped of the careful professional composure she used as armor. What was underneath was something more complicated. "You kept me out to protect yourself," she said. "Not me." "Yes," he said. She was quiet again. A longer quiet. "Then why didn't you fight him if you were cleared?" "Because fighting him publicly would have meant putting everything back in front of people's eyes at 60 years old," he said. "I was tired, Raina. I was tired and ashamed, and I didn't have enough left to go to war." "And now?" He had not expected that question. He looked at the bare oaks. "I'm thinking about it," he said. She didn't answer immediately. They stood on the path in the December cold, not walking, not performing anything, just being in the same space with the truth between them. "I hear what you said," she said finally. "I'm not ready to know what I think about it yet." "You don't have to know," he said. "Take whatever time you need." She looked at him for a moment, that direct, assessing look that Poppy had clearly inherited, the one that took a measurement without announcing it, and then she started walking again. He walked beside her, not half a step behind. Beside. That evening from the hotel, he called a lawyer. He had not planned to do it that particular evening, but telling Raina the story of Crane had done something to the architecture of his reluctance, had shifted a weight he had been carrying in such a fixed position for so long that he had stopped feeling it as a burden and had started feeling it simply as the shape of things. Telling the truth plainly and without decoration had moved something. He could feel where it had been. He found Delia Harmon through Ms. Garland in the indirect way that Ms. Garland arranged most things. She mentioned without being asked that her nephew worked in civil litigation in the city. Her nephew, when Decker called, gave him Delia's name and described her in 2 sentences, which turned out to be exactly 2 sentences more than was necessary. He met Delia Harmon in her office on Market Street on a Thursday morning, 3 days before Christmas. The office was on the 14th floor, orderly, in the way of someone who understood that clarity of space produced clarity of thought. She was 58 with the particular quality of absolute attention. When she looked at you, you had the sense that she was not simultaneously thinking about anything else, which was rarer than it should have been. She read through the documents he brought, the investigation records, the original partnership agreements, the altered contracts, and she did not speak for a long time. When she did, she asked 3 specific questions. She listened to the answers. Then she leaned back. "He made one mistake," she said. "What's that?" "He left a paper trail." She tapped the folder in front of her. "Not a complete one, but enough. The original material requisition documents have discrepancies against the altered versions, subtle but present, and there are transfer records through the secondary accounts that don't resolve cleanly." She looked at him. "This is winnable. Not easily, not quickly, but winnable." "I want a file," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I need to know what you want from this." He thought about it honestly. "I want it on the record," he said. "Not the settlement, the truth. I want a document that says what he did and what it cost. The money is secondary." She held his gaze for a moment. "Most people say something like that and mean something else," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean it." She nodded once. "Then we'll file." He walked back to the hotel with the December cold coming off the Delaware, and the streets full of the particular compressed energy of the city in the last week before Christmas, everyone moving with the slightly heightened urgency of people who have things to get done. He felt for the first time in a long time like a man who was also moving towards something, rather than simply maintaining a holding position. He told Raina about the filing on a Thursday walk 3 days into the new year. He told her directly, without framing. He had hired a lawyer. He was filing against Crane. He wasn't sure how long it would take. He said all of this looking at the path ahead of them. She didn't respond right away. They walked for a while. "Why now?" she said finally. He thought about Poppy on a swing, about the bridge conversation, about the specific quality of presence the little girl brought to everything she engaged with, the complete, unhurried, total attention. "Because I ran out of reasons not to," he said, which was close enough to the truth. Raina was quiet. "Then what do you need from me?" The question surprised him, not the content of it, but the fact of it, that she had asked what he needed. "Nothing right now," he said. "Delia may need a statement at some point about the impact on family. That's months away. There's no pressure." She nodded, kept walking. "Okay," she said. They walked to the end of the path and back. On the way out of the park, Poppy, who had been at the climbing structure and had apparently been monitoring the adults from a height, jumped down and fell into step between them. She took Raina's hand without looking up, the automatic connection of a child to her mother. And then after a few steps, she looked up at Decker. "Are you coming back next Thursday?" she said. "Yes," he said. She looked forward again. "Good," she said. "I have more questions about bridges." At the gate, Raina turned to him. "She saved you a space at her table," she said. "When she set up her drawing things on Saturday, she set out a piece of paper for you." A pause. "She didn't mention it." Ms. Garland noticed. He understood the weight of that. a 5-year-old reserving a space before the person had been invited to fill it. Her birthday is in March, Raina said. Not an invitation. Not an invitation. I'll be here, he said. She held his gaze for one beat. Those words carry a specific weight with me, she said. I need you to understand that. I hear them differently than most people do. I know, he said. I mean them differently than I did before. Something moved in her expression, the specific thing that crosses a person's face when they want to believe something and are just beginning to allow themselves to. She didn't answer. She walked to the car. The call from Ms. Garland came on a Tuesday evening in late January at 7 in the evening when Decker was at the hotel desk going through documents Delia had sent over. Raina lost her overtime, Ms. Garland said. No preamble. Hospital cut the extended shift contracts last week. Budget review. She didn't say anything to me. I noticed because she started bringing food home from the cafeteria instead of buying on the way. A pause. And the rent notice came. $340 more per month. 60 days. Decker put down his pen. She doesn't know I'm calling you, Ms. Garland said. I understand. I'm not asking you to do anything specific. Another pause. I'm telling you because you've been showing up, and because showing up doesn't mean much if you only do it for the easy parts. She hung up. He thought carefully about how to move. Raina was not a woman who responded well to being managed, and she would read it as management if he arrived with offers organized before she'd had a chance to tell him herself. So he waited. He went to the park on Thursday. He helped Poppy with a new project this time, a drawing of a horse which presented its own structural challenges, and he walked with Raina along the oak path, and he waited. She called him the following Monday morning before her shift. Voice flat, relaying facts, the overtime was gone. The rent was going up. She was working on solutions, she was fine. She called, he understood, because not calling him had become a choice that required more effort than she was willing to spend on it. I can help, he said. No. Immediate. Raina. Last time I depended on you, you weren't there. 7 words. He received them without deflecting. I know, he said. I'm not saying it to hurt you. I know that too. A silence, then. I have to figure this out. That's how I work. Okay, he said. Can I say one thing? She waited. Whatever we work out, it needs to be formal. Documented. A contract with fixed terms, a lawyer you choose entirely independently. Nothing that gives me any leverage over your decisions or your life. He kept his voice even. I want you to have something you can enforce without needing to trust me. Not something that depends on our relationship staying what it is. A long pause. Why, she said. Not suspicious, genuinely asking. Because you've built something real out of almost nothing, he said. I'm not walking in to take any of that over. I'm asking to be a support structure, not the building. A pause, Mossoum. You're the building. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he began to wonder if the call had dropped. Then, I'll call a lawyer this week, she said. Someone I find myself. Good, he said. This is separate, she said, from whatever we're figuring out. Yes, he said. Completely. Another pause. Poppy asked me this morning if you know any songs, she said. The subject change was abrupt, which he had come to recognize as her way of moving off something emotional before it went too deep, too fast. I told her I wasn't sure. I know a few, he said. She'll ask you, Raina said. Just so you know. I'll be ready, he said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but lived in its neighborhood. Then she said goodbye and hung up. The support agreement took 3 weeks to draft. Raina had found her own lawyer, a family law attorney named Adele, based in Center City, 22 years of practice, the kind of precise and unhurried competence that inspired immediate confidence. Adele called Decker once early in the process to confirm certain parameters. She was professional and thorough, and gave nothing away about her opinion of the arrangement, which was exactly right. The agreement arrived on a Thursday in mid-February. Raina signed it that evening. Decker signed his copy the following morning and sent it back through Adele's office. Fixed monthly support amount indexed to inflation. 14 months with a formal end date. Medical expenses for Poppy covered separately. A clause that explicitly stated that the financial agreement carried no conditions tied to Raina's personal decisions or her relationship with Decker. It was Adele told Raina during their final call, unusual in the completeness of its protections. Is that unusual? Raina had asked. In my experience, Adele had said yes. It was Ms. Garland who told him about the scholarship on a morning when Decker stopped by the building to drop off something Poppy had left at the park the previous Saturday, a library book about marine engineering that she had been carrying in her coat pocket and had somehow deposited on the park bench during a discussion about underwater tunnels. Ms. Garland met him at the door, took the book, and said without particular preamble, Raina got a letter last week from Jefferson's Nursing Advancement Program, full scholarship last year of the RN to BSN track, for nurses who are single parents pursuing degree completion. She looked at him. I nominated her in October. She didn't know until the letter came. He took that in. She wants to accept, Ms. Garland said. The program is full-time coursework. She'd have to reduce her shifts for 14 months. She looked at him steadily. She needs a bridge, not a rescue. He understood the distinction completely. I'll wait for her to bring it to me, he said. Ms. Garland nodded. She will, she said, in her own time. Raina called him 4 days later. The scholarship, she said. Yes, he said. I want to accept it. A pause. The support agreement does. It cover the gap if I reduce shifts. That's what it's for, he said. The gap for as long as the program runs and Poppy's expenses throughout. A silence. The particular silence of a woman who has been managing alone for so long that accepting help requires a specific kind of courage she has had to build from scratch. Okay, she said. I'm going to accept. Good, he said. Another pause. Decker. First time she'd used his name, not just a sentence directed at him since the hospital lobby. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. Just go back to school. He could hear the corner of her mouth change. Not quite a smile. Something that preceded a smile. Okay, she said. She submitted her acceptance the following Monday. He was at the hotel when she texted him a single word. Submitted. He read it and set the phone down and sat at the small desk for a long time, not doing anything, just sitting with the specific quality of that moment. Then he pulled out the yellow legal pad he'd been using for notes on the crane case and began working through Delia's latest questions because there was work to do and the work didn't stop. It was on a Thursday walk in late February, with the first hesitant suggestions of spring beginning to compete with the winter cold, that Raina told him about Arthur Finch. She did it the way she did difficult things, directly, without preface, in the flat voice she used when delivering information that had weight, and she wanted the weight to land without decoration. Delia's discovery documents came through to me as the family impact witness, she said. I read them. All right, he said. There's a name in the secondary review documentation, she said. Arthur Finch. He was the judicial oversight officer on your investigation. She looked at the path. His signature is on the secondary review clearance. The document that closed the case is settled. A pause. Delia's notes say the timeline indicates he reviewed the altered contracts before signing. He had the documentation. He signed off anyway. Decker walked for several steps without speaking. Arthur Finch, 40 years, law school together, both of them young men with considerable opinions about architecture and justice and the right way to do things. Eleanor's funeral, Arthur standing at the graveside with the specific stillness of a man who understood what the moment was and didn't try to manage it. The handshake afterward, the kind that doesn't need words because the years have made words redundant. Arthur had known. Not necessarily at the start, maybe not at the start, but at the close. He had looked at the documentation and chosen the path of least resistance, which was to sign and let the matter be what Crane had shaped it to be. And then he had gone on to Eleanor's funeral and stood at the graveside and held Decker's hand. When did Delia find that? He said. His voice came out level. He noted that with something like surprise. 2 weeks ago, she called me to ask if you were aware. Raina paused. I told her I didn't know. She said she needed to tell you directly. I'm telling you first. He walked. The oaks were bare still, though there were small swellings at the branch tips that would in another few weeks be the first leaves. He looked at them and thought about 40 years in the specific grief of discovering that someone you trusted made a calculation at your expense and let it stand. Thank you, he said, for telling me. She was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? He thought about it honestly because that was the agreement he had made with himself in this city in these last months. No, he said, but it doesn't change what we're doing. She looked at him sidelong. What are you going to do? Call him, he said. Give him the chance to cooperate voluntarily before discovery makes it something else. A pause. He's 70 years old. I've known him for 4 decades. He deserves a phone call before he deserves a subpoena. Raina was quiet for a long moment. That's more than he gave you, she said. I know, Decker said. That's not the point. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, the specific expression of someone watching another person be better than they were expected to be and being uncertain what to do with the information. She looked back at the path. I'll give the statement, she said, whenever Delia needs it. You don't have to. I know. She kept her eyes on the path. I want to. What happened to our family should be in the record. All of it. Not just his part. A pause. Including the part where you disappeared. You can put that in too. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, her chin level, her jaw set, in the particular way that meant she had thought about something carefully and had arrived at her conclusion and was not interested in being talked out of it. Thank you, he said. Don't, she said. Just finish it. That evening, he pulled the yellow legal pad toward him at the hotel desk and worked through Delia's latest discovery requests. He worked for 3 hours, methodical and precise, in the way he had always worked best, not with urgency, but with the patience of someone who understood that good work was done at the speed it required and not faster. When he was done, he set the pen down and sat back and thought about Poppy, about something she had said in the park 2 Saturdays ago, when he had been explaining to her how an arch distributes its load, how the structure works, not in spite of its curve, but because of it, the bend itself being the source of the strength. Poppy had listened with her characteristic focused attention. Then she had said, so the bent part is what makes it strong. Yes, he'd said. She had looked at this playground arch above the climbing structure, then at him. Huh, she'd said. Thought about it. That's not how I thought it worked. He sat at the hotel desk in the February night and thought about that. He had been bent for 5 years, and he had spent those 5 years treating the bend as damage, as something to compensate for build around keep, hidden from anyone whose good opinion he valued. He had been wrong about that. He could see it from here, from this desk in this city, with this work in front of him, and this family beginning carefully and without rush to let him in. The bent part is what makes it strong. He closed the legal pad. He picked up his phone and found Arthur Finch's number, which was still in his contacts as it had been for 40 years, and which he had not deleted in 5 years of silence, the way you don't delete the number of someone whose significance is structural rather than merely social. He would call in the morning. He set the phone down and looked at the wall, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid of what the morning would bring. The fever came on a Wednesday. Decker knew something was wrong before Ms. Garland called. The way you sometimes know things before the information arrives, a particular quality of quiet in the day, a sense of the air holding something back. He had been at Franklin Square, sitting on his usual bench with a yellow legal pad of notes Delia had sent over that morning, working through the pretrial discovery questions with the methodical patience that the case required. The work was slow. It was also he had come to understand exactly the kind of work he was built for. His phone rang at 8:47 p.m. Ms. Garland's voice was unhurried, which was how she delivered all information regardless of its weight. Poppy has a fever. I've been monitoring since 6. It was 101 then. It's 103.8 now. Raina is on shift and I've called the hospital, but they're in the middle of something on her floor. Decker was already standing. I'll be there in 12 minutes. He was there in 11. The building on Callow Hill was quiet at that hour. The elevator, as it often was out of service. He took the stairs to the 3rd floor without breaking his pace. Ms. Garland opened the door before he knocked. She stepped back without a word, and he entered Raina's apartment for the first time. He let himself see it without commentary. That was the discipline. Not assessment, not analysis, just seeing. Small and managed with a precision that was not decorative but functional. Everything had a place, and everything was in it, not from rigidity, but from the understanding that when space is limited, disorder is a luxury you cannot afford. Poppy's drawings covered one full wall of the living area, not arranged exactly but accumulated, layered, some taped directly to the paint, and others overlapping at the edges, A record of 5 years of looking at the world and trying to put it down on paper. Dogs, mostly. Houses. The marine engineering book he had returned was on the low shelf beside the sofa, alongside 3 others on similar subjects that Raina must have gotten from the library. On the refrigerator, a whiteboard. Poppy's schedule in one color, Raina's in another, Ms. Garland's in a third. A system legible and complete. On the counter, a stack of envelopes. He saw them and looked away. Poppy was on the sofa, in pajamas now pale blue with small yellow stars, and a blanket that was clearly her specific blanket, worn soft from years of being the right blanket. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were at half-mast. She saw him. "My head hurts," she said, in a smaller voice than he had ever heard from her. "I know," he said. He crouched down to her level, his knee making its usual protest, which he ignored. "We're going to take care of it." He looked at Ms. Garland. She handed him a piece of paper temperature log, written in her careful script, times and readings from the last 2.5 hours. He studied it. "She had ear trouble in September," he said, "and she's sensitive to certain antibiotics. Her October appointment flagged amoxicillin." Ms. Garland looked at him for a moment. "That's right," she said quietly. He had looked it up. A month after he first met Poppy, after the library lobby, after the dog drawing, after the first Thursday in the park, he had started reading. Pediatric care standards. Common conditions in children her age. What questions doctors asked. What a grandfather was supposed to know. He had found the name of her pediatrician from something Raina had mentioned in passing. He had cross-referenced the standard intake protocols against what he could piece together. He had not told anyone he was doing this. It had not seemed like something that required announcement. It was simply information that a person in his position should have, and so he had gotten it. He called for a car. He gathered Poppy's things with Ms. Garland's quiet guidance. The blanket, a small stuffed rabbit with one ear longer than the other. That Ms. Garland indicated without words was not optional. The insurance card from a specific pocket in a bag by the door. The system working exactly as it had been built to work. He picked Poppy up. She was heavier than he expected in the way of sick children, the boneless, complete weight of a small person who has stopped managing herself and is simply trusting the person holding her. He adjusted his grip hand under the knees arm at the back, her weight distributed so she wouldn't stir, and she settled against his shoulder with the immediate totality of someone who had decided he was acceptable for this purpose. "Biscuit," she said without opening her eyes. "Got him," Ms. Garland said, tucking the rabbit into the blanket beside Poppy. They went down the stairs. The urgent care center was 8 minutes away. The waiting room was what waiting rooms always were, fluorescent patient, indifferent to the specific nature of anyone's worry. He checked Poppy and answered the intake questions, filled out the forms one-handed, while she remained against his shoulder, and found 2 chairs in the corner where the light was slightly less aggressive. He sat with her and she dozed against him, and he looked at the nature documentary playing silently on the wall-mounted television, something vast and pale, a landscape that looked like it existed on entirely different terms than the ones he lived by. And he thought about the last time he had sat in a waiting room like this. It had been with his wife, with Eleanor, for something that had turned out to be nothing but had not been nothing in the hours before they knew that. Eleanor in the chair beside him, not performing calm, actually calmed the genuine article, because Eleanor had always been able to distinguish between what was happening and what might happen, and she refused to suffer the second in advance of the first. He had always loved that about her. He had never fully inherited it. Eleanor had been gone for 3 years. He thought about her sometimes in the spaces between other thoughts, not with the acute grief of the first year, which had been its own kind of structural collapse, but with the quieter presence of someone who has been woven so completely into the fabric of your daily existence that their absence doesn't announce itself dramatically, but instead shows up in small, constant, unexpected places. The passenger seat of the car. The second cup of coffee he still sometimes started making out of habit. The way a certain kind of afternoon light came through a west-facing window. She would have known what to do here. With Raina, with all of it. She would have known how to hold space without applying pressure, how to move through damage without making the movement feel like an accusation. Eleanor had always understood how to be present in a room in a way that made it easier for everyone else to breathe. He was learning late how to do some version of that himself. Poppy stirred against his shoulder, looked up at him with fever-dim eyes. "Are you going to stay?" she said. "Yes," he said. Right here. She looked at him a moment, the brief conclusive assessment, and settled back. Closed her eyes. He heard the door at 12:47 a.m. He recognized Raina's footsteps before he saw her, the specific quality of purpose in them, the pace of someone moving towards something that matters. She came through the waiting room door, and her eyes moved across the space and found them in the corner. And he watched her take in Poppy, the flush, the blanket, the rabbit tucked against her side, the steadiness of her breathing, and he watched the specific release that moved through her shoulders in the half-second after she confirmed her daughter was okay. Then she looked at him. He was in the clothes he'd been wearing since morning. He had not had time to be anything other than what he was, a 62-year-old man in a waiting room chair with a sick 5-year-old asleep on his arm. No performance, no preparation, just present. She crossed to them and sat in the chair on Poppy's other side and put her hand gently on Poppy's forehead. The professional assessment first, then something softer. She looked at the temperature log he had been keeping, the same format Ms. Garland had started, same careful notation of times and readings. She read through it without speaking. "How long have you been here?" she said. "Since 9:15, he said. "They've been checking in regularly." She nodded, set the log down. "You didn't have to come." "I wanted to," he said. Not loud, not with emphasis, just true. She didn't answer that. He had gotten them both water from the vending machine earlier in the evening, not because anyone asked, just because it was a thing to do, and the doing of it was better than sitting with nothing in his hands. He had noted the time of each temperature reading. He had spoken with the intake nurse twice briefly to confirm that the progression was being tracked. These were small things. He understood they were small things. He also understood that 5 years ago he had not been in this building at this hour with this child on his arm, and that the distance between that absence and this presence was the whole of what he was trying to build. The doctor came at 1:15. Young, efficient, with the particular combination of competence and compassion that the best emergency medicine people develop the ability to hold both the science and the person clearly and at the same time. He examined Poppy, who woke enough to protest the ear scope, with the focused indignation of someone whose personal space had been violated, and then went back to sleep with the speed of someone who had decided consciousness wasn't worth maintaining just for this. The doctor turned to the chart. Family medical history, mom's side. Raina answered concisely, accurately, the practiced fluency of someone who had answered this question at every appointment for 5 years. Dad's side, Decker answered. He answered fully without consulting anything, without pausing for Raina to prompt him. Chronic ear infections on the paternal side, pattern of elevated inflammation response in early childhood, respiratory sensitivity to dust and dander in the family line. The amoxicillin notation, the September episode and how it had presented. He gave the information in the same tone he gave everything, level, precise, organized, and when he finished, the doctor nodded and made his notes. Raina had gone very still beside him. The diagnosis, a bacterial ear infection that had been developing for several days, presenting with fever as the primary visible symptom. Antibiotics, a specific protocol that avoided the sensitivity flagged in the history. Rest fluids, follow up with the pediatrician within 3 days. Fever should break by morning. She's going to be fine, the doctor said. Raina let out a breath, full and slow from somewhere deeper than the chest. He drove them home. He had picked up the prescription from the all-night pharmacy 2 blocks from the urgent care while Raina got Poppy ready to leave, handling the insurance, the paperwork, the small logistics of extraction, and he was waiting at the car with the pharmacy bag when they came out. Raina looked at the bag, didn't say anything. Buckled Poppy into the back seat. Poppy was asleep before they left the parking lot. He carried her up the stairs. The elevator was out as usual. He came in with Poppy against his shoulder, navigating the hallway without turning on the overhead light because the light would wake her, finding the bedroom door by the layout he had mapped when he first entered the apartment. He laid her down with the slow care of someone who understood that this mattered, blanket to her chin. Biscuit positioned within reach of her hand, the specific placement that he had observed Raina use on the one evening he had seen her put Poppy to bed. He stepped back, closed the door most of the way. Raina was in the kitchen, the small light above the stove rather than the overhead, and in that light the kitchen was all warm edges and shadow. She was leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, and her eyes on the middle distance, the posture of someone who has stopped moving for the first time in hours and is now receiving the information her body has been waiting to deliver. He came and stood in the kitchen doorway. The medical history, she said, not looking at him. You knew all of it. Yes. She looked up. I didn't tell you any of that. You've never been to an appointment with her. You've never seen her chart. She was not accusing. She was establishing facts the way she did when she was working something out and needed the pieces in order. I looked it up, he said. About a month after I met her. I started reading what I was supposed to know medically, what to track for at her age, what questions doctors ask. I found the name of her pediatrician from something you mentioned. Read through the standard intake protocols. He met her gaze. I didn't announce it because it didn't seem like something that needed announcing. It's information I should have. So I got it. She looked at him for a long time. What moved across her face in that moment was not simple. It was the specific expression of someone confronting evidence that requires them to update something they have held as settled, not erasing the past, not rewriting it, but placing beside it something that the past said would never exist, and having to reckon with the fact that it does. You prepared, she said. Yes. For something you might never be asked to do. Yes. She looked away. Her jaw was set in the way that meant she was pacing something emotional, keeping herself a few steps ahead of it as she always did. Then Arthur Finch, she said. She had clearly been thinking about this since the walk when she told him. You called him yet? I'll call him this morning, he said, when it's a reasonable hour. What are you going to say? That Delia is sending a formal deposition request. That I wanted him to hear it from me first. He paused. And that if he wants to cooperate voluntarily, the door is open before discovery closes it. She was quiet for a moment. You're giving him more than he deserves. Maybe, he said, but he's 70 years old and I've known him for 40 years, and he's going to have to live with what he did regardless of how this goes. I can give him the chance to do the right thing in the end without pretending what he did in the middle was acceptable. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, the particular shift of someone watching another person hold a thing carefully that could easily be held with less care and being uncertain whether to name what they're seeing. Stay, she said. I'll make tea. It was not a large invitation. He understood that. It was also from Raina the size of invitation that meant something. Yes, he said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Poppy drew rabbits and horses and marine structures. The same table where he now understood Raina had done the arithmetic of survival for 5 years, running the numbers until they balanced or until she found a way to make them balance. They sat with their tea and talked for 2 hours. Not about ARA or the scholarship logistics or the careful structural questions of shared parenting they were slowly working out. They talked about the things that had never been finished. He told her about building the firm from nothing at 31, the first commission, a small community center in Mount Pleasant that had taken 2 years of his life and paid almost nothing and had been the proudest he'd ever been of a piece of work. He told her about the first year after Eleanor died, the specific texture of that winter, the way the apartment in Charleston had become a place he moved through rather than lived in. He told her about the drive up to Philadelphia in November, the radio off the 14 hours of thinking that hadn't resolved into anything usable. She told him about bringing Poppy home from the hospital. Standing in this apartment with a 5-pound baby and the specific terror of understanding that there was no safety net, that it was just her and the system she would have to build from the first brick up. She told him about talking to Poppy out loud in those early months, narrating everything. This is the kitchen. This is where we eat. That's the window. In the morning, the light comes through that way. Not because she knew if it helped the baby, but because it kept her from feeling like she was building in total silence. He looked at her across the kitchen table, at the woman she had become in the years he had missed, at everything she had built in a space the size of this apartment with the materials she'd had. You didn't have to become someone remarkable, he said. You already were. I just wasn't paying attention. She looked at him like she didn't know what to do with that. Then you're not terrible yourself, she said, when you're not having lawyers involved. He almost smiled. The corner of her mouth moved simultaneously. A shared moment, not warm exactly, but real in a way that things hadn't been real between them for a very long time. Around 9, she checked on Poppy, pushed the door open just enough to see, came back and sat down again. Still out, she said. Good. A quiet settled between them, the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. I'm going to call him at 7, Decker said. Arthur, I know, she said. Then after a moment, tell me what happens. I will, he said. He left at 9:30, said goodnight at the door, didn't try to make it more than it was. Walking down the stairs, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not hope exactly. Something quieter than both. The particular feeling of a thing moving in the right direction, slowly but moving. He called Arthur Finch at 7 the next morning. He had not slept much. He had gone over the conversation in his mind through the small hours, not rehearsing it, just letting it settle into its correct shape, the way you let a design resolve before you commit it to paper. Arthur answered on the third ring. His voice carried the slight caution of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing when it would arrive. Decker, he said. Arthur? He kept his voice even, because this was not a moment for heat. Delia Harmon is sending your office a formal deposition request this week. Before that arrives, I wanted to call you. A silence. How much does she have? Arthur said. Enough, Decker said. The secondary review clearance with your signature. The timeline of when you received the documentation against when you signed off. A pause. She'll get the rest in discovery. Another silence. The silence of a man running a calculation. I was advised, Arthur said finally, that the case was essentially settled, that moving it forward would create unnecessary complexity. Who advised you? The pause that followed answered the question. Decker already knew the answer. Crane had a long reach and had used it on the one person whose cooperation would close the door most efficiently. You let it stand, Arthur, Decker said. Not with heat, not with the energy of accusation, just factually the way you read a measurement from a survey. You saw what he'd done and you let it stand, and then you came to Eleanor's funeral. A long silence, the longest in the conversation. I know, Arthur said, 2 words quietly. The specific quiet of a man who has been waiting for someone to say the unsayable, and has found now that it has been said that carrying it alone was heavier than he had admitted. I'm not calling for an apology, Decker said. I'm calling to give you the choice. Voluntary cooperation with Delia's office, or discovery which will be less controlled. Another pause. I'll call her today, Arthur said. Thank you, Decker said. He hung up, sat at the hotel desk, looked at the wall. 40 years. Eleanor's funeral. The handshake at the end of that day, the kind that doesn't need words. He thought about what Raina had said the previous night. You're giving him more than he deserves. He thought about why he had done it anyway. Not because Arthur deserved it, he didn't, but because the alternative was to become a man whose justice was calibrated to what people deserved rather than to what was right. And Decker had spent 5 years being that man quietly and without naming it, and he was done with it. He picked up the legal pad and went to work. The settlement conference with Crane was held on a Tuesday in late March in a conference room on the 16th floor of a building on Broad Street with a view of the city that Decker noted with the professional attention of a man who understood how buildings related to their surroundings. He sat across a table from Whitmore Crane for the first time in 5 years. Crane looked older. Not damaged, Crane had never looked damaged. It was part of his particular talent, but older in the way of someone whose confidence has had to work harder than it used to. He had 2 lawyers. Decker had Delia. Raina sat 1 chair down from Decker on his left side. She had not been required to be there. She had chosen to be, and she had told him so plainly, I told you. What happened to our family goes in the record. Crane looked at her when she sat down. Something moved across his face, reassessment, recalculation. Decker watched him register that this was different from what he had expected. Delia opened. She laid out what they had, the documentation, the timeline, Arthur Finch's voluntary cooperation statement, which had arrived 10 days after Decker's call and had been more complete than even Delia had anticipated. 3 specific pieces of information that closed gaps in the record that had previously required inference. The altered contract documentation with the original version preserved in a backup system Crane had apparently believed was inaccessible. The transfer records, the secondary account structure laid out in sequence. She presented it without drama. The facts were sufficient. Crane's senior lawyer proposed a number. Delia looked at Decker. Decker looked at the city through the window for a moment. The skyline he had spent his career building into and around and alongside the specific way this city's buildings talk to each other across the distances between them. Then he looked at Crane directly for the first time since they'd sat down, and he held that gaze without performance. "The number is acceptable," he said, "on one condition." He slid a single-page document across the table. A written acknowledgement, signed, identifying specifically what was done and who is solely responsible for it. He kept his eyes on Crane. Not legal language. Plain English. What you did and that you did it. Crane's lawyers conferred. Crane looked at the document. Then Crane looked at Decker, and in that look was something Decker had not expected to find there. Not contrition, not regret exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has been seen completely and has nowhere left to position himself. The long game that Crane had always played required the other person to be uncertain about what they knew. Decker was not uncertain. He never had been, really. It took 35 minutes of back and forth to reach agreement on the language. Decker sat through it without impatience. When the final language was agreed upon, Crane signed. Decker looked at the document. He read it once completely the way he read everything that mattered, beginning to end, word by word. Then he folded it and placed it in the interior pocket of his jacket, where it rested against his chest, with the specific weight of something that had been owed for a very long time. He said nothing to Crane as they stood to leave. There was nothing to say. The document said everything, and the document would outlast this room, and that was what mattered. Outside the building afterward, Raina stood beside him on Broad Street in the March light. The first real March light, the kind that carried in it the actual suggestion of spring rather than merely its promise. "How do you feel?" she said. He thought about it. "Like something that has been in the wrong position for a long time just moved into the right one," he said. "Not better exactly, just correct." She nodded. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment without talking. "She asks about you every day," Raina said. He knew who she meant. "What does she ask?" "Whether you're coming Saturday, what you're going to work on." A pause. "She told Ms. Garland last week that you're the person she asks when she wants to understand how things work." Another pause. "Ms. Garland told me. Poppy didn't say it to me directly, which means she meant it." He understood the distinction. "She wants you at her birthday," Raina said. "March 15th. It's Saturday. Nothing elaborate, Ms. Garland, a few kids from her class. She has a project involving bridges, which I've been informed is not negotiable." "It's not," he agreed. She looked at him. "She designated you the structural consultant." "I accept," he said. She looked at the street for a moment. Then, "Stay for dinner tonight. Pasta. She's going to want to discuss the structural requirements, and she cannot discuss structural requirements on an empty stomach. Neither can I, apparently." "I'll be there," he said. She looked at him. The look was direct and clear, and carried in it the particular quality of something that was still forming, not finished, not named, but real, and moving in a direction that both of them were beginning to understand. Then she said 6 o'clock and turned and flagged a cab. He watched the cab pull into traffic. He stood on Broad Street in the March light and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for him, which he noted as something worth attending to. He was not calculating. He was not measuring distances. He was not building towards something with one eye on the risk assessment. He was standing in the light on a Tuesday afternoon in the city where his daughter lived, and his granddaughter was planning a bridge project for her 6th birthday. That was the whole of it. And it was without qualification enough. On March 15th, Poppy's birthday, he arrived at the apartment at 9:30 with two things: a book about real bridges, photographs and engineering diagrams, written without condescension to its reader regardless of age, and a box of pasta in 3 shapes because structure required options. Ms. Garland opened the door and looked at both items and nodded in a way that meant she approved. The apartment was full of the particular pressurized energy of a child's birthday. Not loud, just heightened, as though the air had been asked to hold more than usual. 3 of Poppy's classmates were there in various states of focused activity. Raina was in the kitchen. The smell of something good moved through the apartment. Poppy found him at the door. She was in a yellow dress, the yellow of her park hat, which he suspected was deliberate. She looked at the pasta box and the book, and her eyes did the thing they did when she was taking inventory of new information, a rapid scan followed by a nod that meant she had assessed and accepted. "I already have a design," she said. "Show me," he said. She took his hand simply without announcement, the way she took things she had decided belonged to her, and pulled him toward the table where she had laid out her plans on 3 sheets of paper taped together. The bridge design was structurally plausible, which did not surprise him as much as it would have 2 months ago. He sat down. Raina came from the kitchen doorway and stood watching the two of them bent over the plans. She said something quietly to Ms. Garland, who responded briefly. Then Raina made a sound short and genuine that was unmistakably a laugh. The birthday bridge did not hold weight under the test load, which was a jar of strawberry jam, because Poppy had decided that a bridge that couldn't support jam was not a useful bridge. When it collapsed, Poppy examined the wreckage with scientific detachment and said she now understood specifically where the design had failed. "There's always a next one," Decker said. She looked at him. "Obviously," she said. Dinner was pasta simply made in the way that good food often is not elaborate, just right. They sat around the table, Decker, Raina, Poppy, Ms. Garland, and the three small guests who ate with the complete focus of children who have expended considerable energy and require replenishment. Poppy sat between Decker and Raina. At some point during the meal, without looking up from her plate, she reached over and took Decker's hand and held it for a moment. Not a long moment, just long enough to register. Then she let go and went back to her pasta with no indication that this had been a significant act. It had been. He looked at Raina. She was watching her daughter with the expression he had come to know the specific fullness of it. Pride and exhaustion and love that had been carried alone and was now beginning to be carried differently. She looked up and found him looking. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, that was a longer process, and they were still in the middle of it. Not romance, nowhere close to that, not yet. Just the acknowledgement of two people who had done serious damage to each other through the specific mechanics of love and failure and time, and who had arrived carefully at the same place at the same time and were choosing to stay. After the guests had gone and Poppy was in her room with her new book and her bridge diagrams and biscuit, and Ms. Garland had made her exit with the particular tact of someone who understands when a room needs to be left to itself. Decker stood at the door with his jacket over his arm. Raina leaned against the doorframe. "She kept the failed bridge," she said. "Put it in her notebook." "She'll want to study the failure," he said, "before she builds the next one." Raina nodded. She looked at him for a moment, the direct look, the measuring one, the one he had first seen across a hospital lobby 5 months ago, and that had been telling him something true ever since. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Same time Thursday," he said. "And Sunday." Quietly. A statement being made for the first time, the weight of it tested as it was said. Poppy has questions about suspension bridges that pasta cannot adequately address. "I'll bring better materials," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Okay," she said. And then before he could turn toward the stairs, "Decker." He stopped. "You said you were going to be here. For her birthday." She held his gaze. "You were." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I was." She held his gaze for one more beat. Then she nodded once, and completely the nod of someone who has assessed something and found it accurate, and stepped back and let the door close between them. He walked down the stairs and out into the March night. Philadelphia was doing the thing it did in mid-March, the cold still present, but changed, carrying in it now the first real traces of what was coming. The kind of cold that has started to remember it is temporary. He walked the 6 blocks to the hotel with his hands in his pockets and his face in the night air, and thought about nothing in particular except the specific feeling of walking through a city where people he loved were sleeping. At the hotel, he took the elevator up to his floor, unlocked the room, set his jacket on the chair. He stood at the window that faced the building next door, the same view he had looked at for 5 months. Tonight, he was not looking at the brick wall. He was looking at the lit windows in the building across the way, apartments, each one a different shade of warm light, each one containing a life he knew nothing about and didn't need to. People at tables, people in kitchens, people doing the ordinary things that ordinary nights are made of. He thought, "I should find an apartment here." Not as a plan, not as a declaration, just as the first true thought about the future that he'd had in 5 years that didn't carry the weight of damage management. Not repairing something, not compensating for something, just moving forward, making a choice about where he wanted to be. He had a life in Charleston that had the form of a life. An apartment that was clean and orderly and empty in the specific way that orderly, empty things are empty. Walks on King Street, coffee at the same counter, the bronze plaque on a building he hadn't visited in 4 years. And he had this. A room in Philadelphia with a window that faced a brick wall, and 6 blocks away, a 5-year-old with gray eyes and strong opinions about bridges, and a rabbit with uneven ears, and a woman who had built something extraordinary out of almost nothing, and was beginning one careful Thursday at a time to believe that the structure could bear a little more weight. He was 62 years old. He had time. Not unlimited time, he knew better than to assume that, but enough. Enough to learn the rhythms of this apartment and this family. Enough to show up at the park, in the urgent care waiting room, in the kitchen table, in the birthday with the pasta bridges. Enough to be the person who looked things up before he was asked. Enough to become slowly and without rushing someone Raina could count on, and Poppy could ask questions of, and the future could be built around. He turned away from the window. He sat at the small desk and opened his notebook to a new page. At the top, he wrote a single line. Not a plan, not a list. Just the thing that was true right now, which was the only truth worth writing down. March 15th. She held my hand. He set the pen down, closed the notebook, looked at the blank wall for a moment, and found that the wall for once had nothing to say to him. He turned off the light. Outside, in the direction of the apartment on Callow Hill, with the whiteboard on the refrigerator and the drawings on the walls and the failed bridge in a notebook beside the bed, the city went on being itself ordinary and enduring, full of lives being built and rebuilt and tended in the specific way that lives require, which is to say day by day and with patience and without looking too far ahead. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 5 years he fell asleep without running any calculations at all.